Welcome back to Hawk Off the Press. My name is Madison Hricik. I am the Iowa football beat reporter at the Gazette, and this week we have Ryan Kartje from the LA Times, the USC reporter for the LA Times. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, all right. So we have quite a bit to talk about this week with Iowa and USC playing against each other. First time as Big Ten foes in LA Coliseum, which is kind of cool. And then the last time they've played was the Holiday Bowl in 2019. So it's been a little while. So I'm curious, Ryan, let's just start with the kind of overall thoughts of the Trojan season this year. They're 5-1 in Big Ten play. So they look really good so far. And in my opinion, they're one of the more underrated programs in this conference right now.
Funny story, that bowl game in 2019 was actually my first bowl game on the USC beat. So I was there.
There you go.
They no longer play that game in that stadium either, which is probably a good decision, judging by that day. But no, USC season has been interesting in that there have been a lot of great signs and a lot of inconsistencies throughout. You look at the offense, and like it has been pretty much every year under Lincoln Riley, it has really hummed, especially when the running game has gotten going, and the run game has been one of the better backfields in all of college football. So this team has a lot of offensive firepower. That is usually the case with Lincoln Riley, but defensively has always kind of been the question. It's the same question again this year, and there's a lot of talent, and you can tell in stretches that they have what it takes to be a top tier Big Ten defense, but it's just been very inconsistent. And at their worst, they've had games get away from them. That's how they lost to Illinois. That's how they lost to Notre Dame. It's certainly something that could happen to Iowa. So it's hard to trust USC completely yet. But, you can sort of see the makings of a team that is worthy of the playoff.
Yeah, it's interesting. They've really kind of been one of the most not talked about college football playoff contenders in the country right now, at least just with how the rankings have come out the last 2 weeks. Number 17 for the Trojans this week. It feels like if they have an opportunity to win out, and they have a pretty tough end of the regular season, to kind of close things out, but it feels like that opportunity does exist even with some of those consistencies. Am I correct in that statement?
Definitely. I think, as it stands right now, and a lot of weird things can happen within the Big Ten standings, but as it stands right now, it seems like winning out would be enough for USC to be the third place team in the Big Ten. And arguably, you honestly maybe find yourself in a better spot because you don't have to play in a conference championship game, and yet you still make it into the playoff. But there's a lot still left to go in between that. So, and there are a lot of hurdles, including, certainly this weekend.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about this particular matchup. Right now, the betting line was a 6.5 point favorite towards the Trojans. USC's done really well at home this year, 5-0 throughout the year. Is there something that you've noticed with how USC has played at home, maybe in comparison to some of those road matchups where those losses have existed, maybe? Or has it just kind of been a situation where it all depends on which side of the ball shows up and shows out?
I think they usually have an easier time getting started at home, especially offensively. And Jaden Mayava, their quarterback, has been, a lot better at home than he has been on the road for the most part. So I think those two things are part of why. But I also think on the road, they've had a lot of tough matchups. So, it's hard to take too much from, the disparity between the two. But so I wouldn't read into that too much coming into this game. But I do think, given the stakes of this one, we might see a pretty good environment in the Coliseum. Although, heavy rain is not really something that LA fans are into. So that could also adversely affect things too.
Yeah, I say the last forecast said it was going to be low 60s and a lot of rain, kind of starting sporadically and then just kind of turning into just a straight, just complete wet football field. So that obviously is not the end all be all, but it's something to certainly keep in mind of. Speaking of Maeva, wanted to ask about the two quarterbacks that'll be at facing each other between Maeva and Mark Gronowski. Both pretty mobile quarterbacks, both have the ability to kind of flash in their own ways. What have you seen from just kind of taking a look at in understanding Iowa's offense. What have you seen from Gronowski in his one season with the Hawkeyes so far?
I think what has impressed me the most about him and what I know Danton Lynn, USC's defensive coordinator, has brought up is, you know, just how Iowa's been able to use, designed quarterback runs really to their advantage in moving the offense in the exact way that an Iowa offense likes to move. Um, and I think like in the red zone, especially, that is such a valuable weapon when your quarterback is as big and as powerful as he is. And I think against USC, that's sort of a unstoppable force, immovable object situation in which USC's actually been very good in the red zone on defense. That's been probably the best aspect of this defense to date. Uh, Only allowing like basically 2/3 of trips into the red zone to end in points, which is third in the nation. Um, so that'll be a really interesting matchup if Iowa's able to move the ball into the red zone uh, and really just eat up clock. Can they get USC's defense on their heels? It's something we've seen. Out of that's what Illinois did basically in USC's first loss of the season. So there is a blueprint for making it happen, and I think USC has been gashed on the ground like in those games. I mean, against Notre Dame, Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price combined for over 300 yards rushing. So this is a really interesting coaching matchup, I think, between Iowa's offense and USC's defense. And the key is just, can USC's defense get Iowa off the field, force them into third and longs, and make Gronowski have to throw, which in like very predictable downs, which is not Iowa's strength. And I think, if USC is able to really do that throughout, then USC will probably win this game.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned was Iowa's ability, or any team's ability really, to kind of eat up the clock and kind of keep that USC defense on the field as long as possible. Iowa's done that a couple times. They did that against Oregon last week, especially leading into that what would have been the game-winning touchdown drive until that 39-yard field goal was kicked for the Ducks. So I'm curious, have you looked at the matchup and the comparison between some of the familiar foes that these two teams have faced so far this year? And if you haven't, then I guess what about the offense defense coaching matchup is the most intriguing to you? Is it the line? Is it the ability to like force Gronowski to make those predictable throws? What about it are you honing in on the most?
I haven't done a ton of study of other common opponents, but I really think USC's defensive line and linebacking core, and maybe especially the linebacking core, because that's kind of been a weakness of the defense throughout this season. I think it'll really be on them to be more sound than they've been in recent weeks. And I think the biggest difference with USC, especially with that front, is has shown up in the first and second. The difference between the first and second halves the last 2 weeks, like against Northwestern and Nebraska, in the second half, USC holds both of them to just a field goal in each game, which they looked outstanding after halftime in both games, and that's a credit to Danton Lynn making adjustments. He's always been very good at that, but you know I think this game will really be decided in how both of those two units set the tone initially. If Iowa takes up 2/3 of the first quarter with a 17 play drive, like that's really going to put USC on their heels. And, when the weather is as bad as it is, it becomes a little bit more predictable of a game in terms of having to lean on the run. You know, can USC's running back, who is a walk on and who has been very good to this point of the season, but, struggled a little bit against Notre Dame in a similar situation, like, you know, can they continue to like play that same game that Iowa has set the tone of? And I think it really just depends on who sets the tone first for this game. Because if USC just starts, you know, launching the ball down the field and, scoring long touchdowns, like Iowa's just not going to be able to keep up. And USC, I think, will, USC could very well win this game by 3 touchdowns in a situation like that. Um, But if I was able to establish things, if USC's linebacking core, really struggles to stop Gronowski, or, lets up big plays to Kamari Moulton, or, just any various like things happen in the run game, I think it could be just a long day for USC's defense. And we've seen it happen before.
Yeah, well, I think the idea of the game going to a shootout is something that maybe some football fanatics wouldn't hate to see, but I don't necessarily know if there's any Iowa fans out there that would love the idea of a shootout, especially in the rain, on the road, all of those kinds of factors into it. But you did mention USC's running back King Miller. I did want to ask about him. 636 rushing yards this season, 5 rushing touchdowns. He's a walk-on. You mentioned it. And he's somebody that competed for playing time. Have you seen a player like this make that kind of a jump and to be able to earn the playing time he has, especially in, I mean, I guess this modern era of college football? But for him to have the season he's having, what have you made of that?
I haven't. I've seen, walk-on stories where you maybe see a guy who you can tell that maybe you can tell why he's a walk-on, but maybe just out of some circumstances, one game goes right. One long run, he breaks. And at the beginning of the season, King Miller, like one of his first carries was a 75-yard touchdown run. And it felt like a cute story at the time, right? But ever since then, he just kept doing the same thing. Every game, he's broken a long run. Uh, so at this point, I think, we just have to classify this as a huge miss by all these other schools. Now, he did have a couple scholarship offers, Portland State, San Jose State, Nevada, but these were not big schools. And his high school coach told me that most coaches like D1 coaches told him that they thought King wasn't going to be fast enough, uh, which is truly amazing given all the breakaway runs he's had, like I said. So, yeah, it was a big miss by everyone but USC, and USC was very lucky that he happened to have dreamed of being a USC running back his entire life. So now he's really doing it.
Yeah, well, and then just pulling up his stats here, he's had 4 rushes, at least 4 games where he's had at least one 40-plus yard rush. That longest one being the 75-yard one at the season opener. I mean, that's impressive. And it is interesting that you say that, he was originally told by some coaches that his speed was the issue. I watched some of his highlights from this past season. It does not look like you would have to fool me for that. Like,
I'm not sure what they were watching.
yeah.
So and maybe, maybe there's been a significant change since then, but his high school coach was like, we were baffled at the time. And USC, I mean, USC didn't offer him a scholarship either at the
Mhm.
time. They just happened to be kind of lucky that he was willing to take a preferred walk-on spot over getting a scholarship at other spots. But it's really paying off now because they, had clearly a very deep running back room. And, hopefully in the next couple weeks, maybe even as short as next week, maybe we see Wayman Jordan, who, at the beginning of the season was really looking like honestly one of the best, running backs in college football.
Mhm. Well, let's stay with offense and just flip to a different skill position and talk about this receiving room a little bit. You mentioned that, you know, uh, there's a chance for this game to really go against Iowa and it become a shootout where USC's offense is able to just exploit everything. And just looking at numbers and looking at how this receiving core has developed this year, I mean, you've got a majority of catches going to a handful of players like every year, but it feels like there's a number of receivers that have gotten involved throughout this season. How deep has this room been for Maeda to be able to make those kinds of plays throughout this year?
It's not even so much the depth of the receiver room as it is the fact that the tight end room is as good as it's been since Lincoln Riley took over at USC. And, they've been able to use both Lake McCree and Walker Lyons, who are, both viable starting Big Ten tight ends on the field at the same time, which I think that 12 personnel, as Iowa knows quite well, is, the flexibility that you have out of that is just something that he hasn't been able to do really since he was at Oklahoma. And that was, one of the keys of, Oklahoma's like dominant running game at the time. And we've seen the results this year. Like they've been as good running the ball as they've been, in any of Riley's 4 years. Uh, so yeah, it's I think those two tight ends being able to really take some of the receiving load off of some of these other receivers who, I wouldn't say, I would say there's a pretty big gap between, the third and fourth receiver after the first two. Um, but the first two are, arguably I would say is a top five, duo, receiving duo in all of college football. You start with Mekhi Lemon, who has just been incredible after the catch with the ball in his hand. Rarely ever lets the first person get him down and is just, always open over the middle of the field. So, he does most of his work out of the slot, and that coupled with the tight ends has really been just like a devastating combination in the middle of the field. And that's kind of where Jay Mayava has, done really well and has improved his game down the field this season. So, Mekhi Lemon first is your number one, and then you have Jacoby Lane, who is, kind of that perfect, catch in traffic, jump ball guy, and had 12 touchdowns last season to lead the Big Ten on something like, I think he only had like 38 catches. So essentially every third catch was a touchdown, but he's fought through some injuries this year, so his stats maybe aren't as gaudy as Lemon, who's going to, probably lead the Big Ten in receiving. But, he is just as dangerous, just in a very different way. So you have a very varied, passing attack. And then, Jaden Mayava has really just been sharp down the field and, hasn't turned the ball over, which has been a huge difference from last year.
Yeah, the turnovers are particularly were something that I noticed with Maeva, with just his ability to just complete passes, especially ones like to Lemon, like to Lane, that sometimes are contested balls, sometimes one-on-one opportunities. And so I do notice that, and I think that also might be a key for Iowa's defense, is trying to get Maeva to throw a pick or just get uncomfortable and not maybe throw to the best option out there, especially when you do look at that 12 personnel and you have, I mean, you put the 12 personnel on the field, that's a lot of options to give the ball, whether, like, regardless of which way you want to go. And so I do think a turnover scenario is going to probably be a huge part of Iowa's defensive plan. But getting down to, in my opinion, this is one of my favorite parts of doing these podcasts with other reporters. I'm going to ask you these two questions. I want to know, what is it going to take for USC to be able to walk out of the Coliseum with a win? And then on the flip side, what is it going to take for Iowa to be able to walk out of the Coliseum with a win?
I think it's almost the same answer, but in a sort of a different flavor in both ways. I think for USC to walk out with a win, and I kind of said it earlier, I think first it starts with the defense starting strong. If they're able to get early stops, like I said before, if they're able to force Iowa into third and longs, their pass defense has improved a lot, I think, over the last couple weeks. And, um, I think that would put Iowa in a bad spot, because then, once Iowa's on its heels, USC's offense can be really devastating with big plays down the field. And, Mekhi Lemon gets it going, and suddenly, like, he has 12 catches in the game. And I certainly won't rule out that happening, but I think we probably know how things are going to go in the first quarter, because we'll see just what kind of tone has been set by USC. And I think, if that's Jaden Mayava throwing down the field, no pressure on him. The offensive line is looking great. I just don't, like I said before, I just don't think Iowa can keep up if that's the game that ends up being played. Um, Iowa walks out with a win if the rain has just made this an ugly game. Uh, Gronowski has sort of forced USC's linebackers into bad situations. USC has a turnover, like you mentioned. I think that is a huge part of this game. Really, just all the boring stuff kind of goes Iowa's way, and that is an advantage certainly that Iowa has in this game, because USC has in games like that, USC has performed pretty poorly. Or down the stretch when they find themselves in critical situations in which they need to come through or they can't make a mistake, uh, they've shown a propensity for making those mistakes. So I think if Iowa can force those mistakes and can play the game that it wants to play, kind of exactly like you said before, like they played last week against Oregon. I don't know that USC can keep up with Oregon. So I think, already Iowa was within a game-winning field goal of winning that game. So, um, so yeah, I think that would be the formula generally, and I think Kirk Ferentz has shown that he's pretty good at being himself when it comes to this stuff, whereas Lincoln Riley has sometimes gotten a little antsy when put into these situations where he needs to just trust in things and USC just needs to, get the job done. So it's a really fascinating mental battle, I think. And I'm really interested to see that play out.
Yeah, those are I like that breakdown. I think that makes sense. And honestly, I don't think there's a lot of college football, at least Big Ten Iowa fans that are going to be opposed to a low scoring, gritty, maybe even a little sloppy kind of game because that seems to be the MO for the Hawkeyes over the last, up 10 years at this point. One final question for you, Ryan. This does not have anything to do more so with this weekend's matchup, but we do have to ask this. What was your reaction to the fake punt against Northwestern last weekend?
Uh, I my first reaction was just shock. Uh, then it went into respect, and then it was, wait, is this actually legal? And then it sort of lingered there for a while. And then I think I kind of went back to I kind of respect it. And I understand and I fully respect like why people think it's Bush League. It probably is. I think that's fair to admit. Um, but that said, you know, I think he found a loophole in the rules, maybe knowing that even if they tried to call the penalty, let's say they were fully aware of it, they would have already pulled off the fake punt. So it really wouldn't have mattered. Which I sort of respect the attitude about that. And that I will say, and I wrote this in my newsletter, like that's just so quintessentially Lincoln Riley. Like
Mhm.
he is gonna push the limit. He doesn't really care if you are, if you care about it. And he's occasionally brilliant in those ways. And also like I think to piss people off. So uh I think it worked out just exactly like he wanted it to, and there's nothing really anyone is gonna do about it now, so I think he thinks he won. Now, the one thing I respect most, I'll say this, was USC social media accounts, yesterday
I
started posting
saw this.
videos making fun of it, kinda leaning into the villain role, and
Mhm.
that's what USC has been missing for way too long. They should always lean into the villain role.
Commit
They're
to the
great
bit.
at it.
Commit
Keep
to
doing it.
the bit. No, I saw the video, and I think that was what prompted me to say, "Okay, I need to make sure, when you and I sit down and talk, I ask about this," because that the video I thought the video was hilarious. I fully love when teams and organizations lean into humor of those kinds of situations. But I think I had to watch the play, like, 3 or 4 times to, like, actually process what had happened. So to see it in real time and then process it after the fact, had to have been a very interesting experience in that Friday night game for sure.
I'm still processing it,
Yeah,
honestly.
I don't blame you. All right, Ryan. Well, thank you so much. I know this has been a very hectic week with not just football, but all of the other sports that are in action. So I do appreciate the time. All right. And if you guys like this content, please continue to follow the podcast that comes out once a week. And then I also have a newsletter that comes out every Friday morning. It's free to sign up at the Gazette. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.